Welcome to the Becoming Sound podcast, where we dive into the tough stuff and try to find the humor in the hot mess of being an adult child. Join me as we peel back the layers on growing up in dysfunction, navigating substance abuse, mental health challenges, and everything in between. Hello, friends. Today, I have the pleasure of sitting down with Kim Long, a registered psychologist, and she is the director of Dochas Psychological Services, where her and her team of mental health professionals believe that health happens when mind, body, and emotion are reintegrated. They will guide you to be able to think and feel without wanting to run away, fight, or freeze. And because of this, Kim uses an approach that speaks to all of these things. She loves to work with adolescents, adults, women and men, first responders, and veterans. The type of issues she explores with her clients relate to depression, anxiety, trauma, grief, loss, relationships, life transitions, among other things. And online counseling is even an option. This is actually part one of the conversation between Kim and I. We chat about childhood trauma, her story, identity, coping mechanisms for both the substance abuser and the people that live with them. So let's dive right in. So welcome, Kim. It's nice to have you here.
Thanks for inviting me. It's going to be awesome.
Oh, you're welcome. So tell my audience what it is you do and a little bit about yourself and your company.
Okay. I identify as a base brat, but I am a registered psychologist in the province of Alberta, and I am very fortunate to work with a team of psychologists, provisional psychologists, mental health therapists, and interns at Dochas Psychological Services, which is my practice. And Dochas kind of came to be because of my parents. So my dad really identified with his Irish ancestry. So it's Gaelic. And my mom and I used to read a book series together, and Dochas was the name of the women's shelter, and it means hope. So That's kind of what we try to offer. Yeah. And we work with like general stuff all the way up to complex PTSD and all that. Everything in between.
Yeah.
So,
Which is a lot.
Which is a lot. And I have an amazing team. I could not do this without them.
That's awesome. And you're based out of Spruce Grove?
Yes.
Yeah. Nice.
Spruce Grove, Alberta.
Yeah. So if anyone wants to get in touch, we'll have all that in the show notes anyways. But so what led you to do the work that you're doing?
I think honestly a comedy of errors. So I thought I was going to be a guidance counselor in the schools. I thought that that's what I wanted to do, or to work with students who struggle with different developmental disabilities, things like that. But when I graduated high school, I didn't get into education, and I got into my arts undergrad, psych, and I loved it. I was fascinated by people, fascinated by their stories. It's just how I grew up. And then went into teaching eventually. And there was a particular situation where a student came to me with a question. And the question involved mental health. And we didn't have the resources to help that child or her friend. We had people who could maybe come see them once every 4 months. And then I said, you know what? I need to just get over my fear and go back and believe that I can do this. And so I went back in my 40s and I became a registered psychologist. And I love people and their stories and how resilient they are. I learned so much from my clients, almost more than I think they actually get from me. But it just, even when the stories are super dark, you still see how beautiful people are. And so I'm lucky that they trust me with their stories. I love doing this job. Yeah.
I love that. It's so true. You know, the more people I talk to on this podcast and I get to know, and whether they're, just telling their story or therapists or whatever, it's amazing what you learn from people by just getting curious and listening, and people are amazing, and the ability for them to heal and tap into their own resources with help is incredible. So I love it.
People have the answers in them already. I just help them find it, and I sit with them so they aren't alone when it feels that dark. I'm almost like a candle or a flashlight and go, okay, let's figure this out, right? And honestly, again, that comes from my parents being in the military and moving around the world. They said, you're an ambassador for yourself, your family, and your country. And so it's your job to help people feel loved and appreciated for whatever moment of time they find themselves in. And that's really the mission of Dochas, is having people feel that acceptance, feel that welcoming, no matter what they're struggling with and no matter how they present with that. We try to understand why they're making the choices they're making. So, yeah. So I blame my parents.
So important, right? Yeah. I think there's just so many people out there, and I was one too before, is you go through life and you have these patterns and all this stuff that keeps coming up, and it's like you're repeating the same things, and you think you can do it all by yourself. Like you think, well, if I'm not helping myself or healing myself or finding the answers, I must be failing, And I truly believe we're just not meant to do this alone,
Well, it's funny you explain it that way, because I am the world's biggest hypocrite, because I believe this for other people and this is the mission. And yet when I need help, oh my gosh, it is the hardest thing to ask for. And like you said, if I'm not doing it on my own, I do feel like I'm failing or I'm a burden or, and that's really, it's hard to juggle both parts of me when, so I just admitted to my clients, a hypocrite moment. Like,
which, I mean, we're just human, right? You just have to admit when you're just having a human moment, you can't do and be everything for yourself, right? And I'm not a therapist, but I find myself in those moments in many areas of my life. It's like I dole out great stuff. Can I take my own advice sometimes, right? So, but it is important to have help. And I think that therapists and all different modalities of healing are so important. And we're kind of in a healing age, where it's so out in the open. It's so talked about now, where it never was when I was young. And it's so important to get people the help that they need. And it's break down those fears, I think, that are there, I read on your website that you said that you can relate to the fears, the insecurities, the frustrations and confusion that people have. So can you elaborate on that? Do you want to tell us a little bit about your story?
Sure. So, well, first of all, to build on the point you just mentioned about therapy being accessible and out there now and talked about, I've been in therapy myself for 20 years now, and I have an amazing therapist because, I need to take care of my own brain and the way I process the world. And just because I'm a psychologist, it doesn't mean that I can apply to myself what I know works, because we have these lenses that come from our youth that we don't always know about. And so, I was fortunate to grow up in a family with super supportive parents. But they had struggles that I didn't always identify when I was little. So unfortunately, my dad struggled with alcoholism. He was a binge alcoholic. So I didn't always understand why mom and him would get heated, because they never fought in front of us. And so I just remember taking on the role of peacekeeper and being the clown and trying to make dad laugh. And yet at the same time, my parents were very accepting of myself and what I wanted to do and who I was. So it's, again, that kind of contradiction that you grew up with, where you're just confused and uncertain because you're constantly reading the environment. And then growing up military, it's a very supportive community, but a lot of military families struggle with the same issues of, too much partying to cope, or trying to make ends meet, because we don't actually pay our military service people very well, in my opinion. So I know I'm jumping around quite a bit. That's just how it processes in my brain, I guess, is it's still hard sometimes to put those pieces together in a way that feels honest and true,
Yeah.
you know, and that creates anxiety and uncertainty because you remember things in your childlike brain one way.
Yeah.
And then as an adult looking back, you go, well, maybe that wasn't the healthiest thing for me.
Yeah.
But I love my parents and I'm thankful for everything they
Mm-hmm.
provided. So it's kind of having to acknowledge that no childhood is perfect, and what choices can I make as an adult to cope with patterns I learned of how to be in the world.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if I'm answering your question.
No, that's great. I
it's
think
jumbled in my head.
No, and
Yeah.
I think kids who grew up in this environment too, it is jumbled in your head. And
Yeah.
the amount of time that goes by, no matter how much healing or work you've done on yourself, you have these deep programs that there's things that even with awareness catch you off guard, right? I think something you said with relation to when you grow up and become an adult and you have to find these methods of coping and how to be in the world. I think there's a lot of us who maybe have some deeper programs, and when you're a young adult, you don't recognize that you're in that programming. You don't recognize that, oh, I might need to change. Know something's wrong. Like you have these reoccurring things and you're like, what is wrong with me? But you don't always recognize that you're actually in response patterns and you're in a fight or flight or freeze or whatever it is. How do you go about starting to recognize that stuff?
Well, and I just want to acknowledge that everybody's experience is so different. So, I mean, I think when people think of alcoholism, for example, they think, the person's drinking all the time and all that stuff. Because my dad would typically only do it on a weekend, you grow up, and it wasn't every weekend. So you kind of grow up thinking, when's it going to happen? So it's like you're waiting instead of another experience where it's constant and that becomes your normal. And so as an adult, it's more, how to explain that? My process was more acknowledging that something in me was staying disconnected. And I could feel that in my body. It's like I was always watching. And then I started to become almost OCD. Like I need things in their place. And so I guess going back to the term chaos takes on different forms. It's not, things are flying around and there's lots of yelling. Sometimes chaos can be very, very quiet. And it can just be this sense of, oh, what am I waiting for? And so acknowledging that tension in my body and going, this isn't normal. Like people, how does this person seem so laid back? So for me, it definitely started from a place of increasing my awareness about my felt experience and just being curious about it, not judging it, but just being like, that seems different than what other people are experiencing. And then, being open-minded to other people's perceptions. So what I mean is not taking what they say as this is who you are, but the only way I ended up in therapy was because my doctor pointed out to me that I was depressed. Because I came in with a bunch of symptoms. I had already had my undergrad in psych. I came in with a bunch of symptoms and she goes, you're depressed, right? And I was like, what do you mean? Yeah. And so she lists the symptoms all back to me. And I'm like, okay, well, when you put it like that, I guess maybe. So I had to be open to that, not meaning that there's something wrong with me. It's just the way my system learned to respond.
Yes, I think that's so important.
So not taking that personally and being open to, okay, now I can go and seek help from a professional.
Yeah.
In whatever way that looks like. Some people decide to go the med route first. I didn't, out of sheer stubbornness. But I think it all starts with awareness.
Yeah.
And being open to that without judging it, which is hard.
It is hard because I think, for myself too, I just identified myself as that, instead of being able to separate it. I really had this deep thinking that that was me. That was my identity, you know? And so that becomes the way you show up in the world. And you think, well, that's just the way I am.
If you don't
And
mind sharing, like, what was your identity?
honestly,
what route did you go?
you know what? My dad was an alcoholic, there was a lot of chaos, but I was very on edge. I was a people pleaser, try to minimize the chaos at all costs. So I'd always be on high alert, very hypervigilant and trying to minimize things in the home, all that stuff. And then when I was a teenager, I just kind of flipped. It was like I became angry at everything and everyone. And then I would just start fights because I felt comfortable in the chaos. And so I would just start fights. Yeah. And then all I wanted to do was get out of there, And then as a young adult, I was high achiever. I would, take on jobs where I could excel really fast and always busy doing things. And I think in relationships was where the chaos started to come back. I would attract great people, good-hearted people, and then proceed to destroy it.
Implode it. Yeah.
Yeah. And because I was comfortable in chaos, I was comfortable in that fighting kind of mode. And I think that I couldn't find my identity really. I think, like you said before, I was always asking myself that question, who am I? What am I supposed to do in this world? Who am I? What am I supposed to do? Why am I repeating patterns? I had awareness, but not enough to do something about it because I was also holding my feelings in. And so I did not want to reach out at first. So it was lots of chaos, right? And it wasn't till years later in my 40s when I'm like, okay, this has got to stop. Like, I recognize now that these patterns have got to stop. And I started to get help in different areas. I've had a couple therapists along the way who were great. I've done other things too. And I just think it's so important that when you're in these cycles that you do gain some awareness. You learn that it's not you. There's some programming in there and that it needs to be addressed, right?
Well, and everything is, in my opinion, is a survival response, right?
Yes.
So like I'm starting to practice more from this lens of internal family systems, which basically says that you've got these protectors and the protector is designed to protect your wounded self, wounded part of the self. And they're just doing their job. So these parts of you that come up and do things that you're like, well, that was a little damaging upon reflection.
Yeah.
It's actually doing its job because it learned at that age that that was the skill you had to protect yourself with. And it doesn't age with you. So we end up with these maladaptive coping strategies that worked in the past, but don't work in our present.
Yeah.
And it's not that you're crazy or messed up or any of that stuff. It is actually your system doing what it learned would protect you the best.
Yeah. It's like your brain's hardwired for safety.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Like we're hardwired for survival.
Yeah.
And that, that all factors into it. And it's interesting as we're talking because I'm noticing, so again, that awareness piece in my body, there's this desire to defend my dad, right?
Yeah.
And I don't know if you still notice that within yourself, but it's like I have two versions of my dad, and this is what helped me. So this, for any people kind of struggling with this, with people that have addiction or people that are maybe not always the healthiest for them, my dad is my dad, but my addicted dad is Eric. So, Eric and I don't always get along, but man, my dad was great.
Yeah.
So there's permission there to be like, okay, I have boundaries now around how I interact with Eric, and my boundaries are different in how I deal with that.
Yeah.
So, but again, it goes back to giving yourself permission to just let your system do what it's supposed to do and be aware of when it's healthy for you and when it's not.
Yeah,
and then work through that. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. And same thing for me. My dad's been gone quite a while, but after he passed was when lots of stuff come up for me.
Yes.
But as I heal and as I do the work and as I've grown over the years, I have that too. I can see my dad as two separate people, and I understand the disease so much more, and I understand his actions and the the love I have for my dad has just grown exponentially over the last few years. And understanding it really just softens you and makes you aware of what he went through too, so exactly that. And if you have a dad that is still alive, being able to separate that is like an awareness tool, right? Yeah.
The biggest gift my dad gave to me was shortly before he passed. And he had said, because I asked him, like, Dad, why don't you just get help? Like, you're struggling with this addiction. And he said, I don't trust anything to heal me or keep my emotions at bay the way this does.
Yeah.
So it was, again, that it just changed my thinking about it, where, oh, this is a choice, but it's not a choice.
Mm-hmm.
Like, he doesn't have another survival strategy.
Yeah. He doesn't have another medicine.
With everything that he grew up in an alcoholic family, and they grew up in it. So, this is generations. And so for him to say that, like you said, it was his medicine. It wasn't, it wasn't him wanting to do that. Like, it's convoluted, but to me, it felt like it made sense.
Yeah. I heard this guy speak just recently on a video, and he said, the disease is not alcoholism. The disease is in me. And once the alcohol is gone, I still have the disease.
Yes.
And it's me I have to address. And I was like, mind blown, because he just explained it so well,
Yeah.
It's so true. And I think we all have that in our own ways. We all have things that we are trying to process, or pain, or stuff that we live with, shame and guilt and all this stuff, whether it's as a person, as a parent, every which way in the world you show up, you got something going on from your past. And like, I don't think I've met a person who, people say the word normal, and I'm like, I don't even know what that is.
No, normal's not normal.
Show me a lineup of people who have had a normal upbringing and have no side effects. It's just not out there, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, and look at all the different ways we even choose to cope now. Like, we're talking about alcohol, but there's shopping, there's technology. Like, not enough people are talking about technology.
I know.
Like, the doom scrolling, that's a survival strategy too. So, I'm not here to judge anybody for how they cope. I just want to know, is that something you want to change? And let's look at changing that, right? And unfortunately, Dad was too scared of change at his age, but it helped me have space for. I struggle with the word forgiveness, but it helped me have space for understanding and more empathy for him. Because when you think about some of the things that people do deal with that they don't actually ever talk about, it's like, holy, no wonder you chose food to help you cope.
That's right. It's just a coping skill, right? It's not an identity. It's just something that you use to get through. So the stuff that you're hanging on to, right?
But then trying to figure out who you are.
Yeah.
Like, I'm fascinated by what you were talking about in terms of identity, because I, quote unquote, identify with that, where even at my age and your age, we're still going, who are we? And when you grow up kind of subconsciously making choices for other people, how do you figure out who you are? And I think that's why part of my practice is focusing on identity and figuring out what is the real you and making that be okay.
Yeah, exactly. And I think there's some beauty in that too, is that finding out who you are is a life process too. It's like you learn, you change, you grow, you evolve, so really who you are at your core, you have in there. It's just learning what you love, what lights you up, what brings you joy, all of that stuff, what makes you sad, what brings you fear and anger. I think it's just a journey and it's so complex, right? And so when I say now to myself, well, I don't know who I am, I think, well, I do know who I am. Deep down, I do know who I am, and I'm okay with me. It's just figuring out all this other stuff, this external stuff, and how do I show up with that, right?
Yeah.
So
I think what you're saying is super important because, and I love that you added in the other emotions that many of us try to avoid, like sadness, right?
Mm-hmm.
The reality is, and this is where I struggle a little bit in my field, because we talk a lot about self-regulation strategies, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where you don't lose your mind in public,
Yeah.
where you're vulnerable. So
Yeah.
those strategies are important. Where I think they become a hazard in mental health is when we use them to squash down the process. We don't allow ourselves to feel because, we got to manage that emotion. That's not allowed to be here. No, an emotion is just an emotion. It's what we do with it that
Yeah.
matters. And so I think some of us sometimes avoid the processing of it all in what they call service to self-regulation. Well, I'm practicing mental health because it's self-regulate. No, that's just another form of control.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So I just wanted to sneak that in there, my little soapbox issue.
No, it's so true because you hear about it a lot. And I mean, yeah, there's a lot of people who have completely unregulated nervous systems.
Yeah.
You know, they've been living in a cortisol state for years and years and years. And it's coping any other way, just they don't understand how, but they're aware that it's happening. It's just, how do you get out of that cycle? But I think that there's so many terms thrown around nowadays, and people don't know how to, they think they have to identify with everything, or they don't know how to fix it. And what they realize is they don't need to be fixed. They just need to learn how to manage all this stuff, right? Because it's part of life.
Yeah. You're not broken. You're just surviving.
Yeah.
And your way of surviving might be something that somebody else doesn't really like. And so they tell you that you're supposed to fix it. Well, maybe that's coming from a place where they're in survival mode.
Exactly.
Right? Like we're doing the best we can.
Yeah.
But you're not broken.
Yeah. Learning to trust ourselves is a big thing too. Learning to trust myself. And it came in short little bursts and stuff. And then one day I'm just like, you know what? I really do know. I do know inside. And then I can make choices differently. Right. So it's work. It's work. It's just like going to therapy, going to see a therapist, going to whatever modality. It is work. This isn't easy stuff. It's totally doable, but it's not easy. It does take work, and you have to be committed and want to, right?
Yeah. Well, like you said, it is a lifelong journey, right? That now we're undoing patterns that we've spent, like you said, 40 years of your life using. Well, that's just not undone in a moment.
No.
That takes practice and constant awareness. And, it's so rewarding, but it's also really, really hard, and you reminded me of something that my previous therapist used to say to me all the time. And I still shake my fist at her for retiring, but whatever. It was from Goethe, and it is, when you trust yourself, then you will know how to live. And like at some point, I'm going to get that tattooed on my body, because she used to say it every session.
It's so true. That internal trust will take you so much further in your life, in any realm. Yeah, that's so true.
Thank you for joining me today on another episode of Becoming Sound. If this episode resonated with you in some way, please share it with someone you care about. And don't forget to hit the subscribe button. It helps to get this information out to more people who may need it. If you have a sec, I would love a follow on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. While you're there, hit the 5-star rating and give me a review. When you're scrolling, follow me on my social platforms, and I would love to hear your comments and feedback. Have a fabulous day, lots of love and gratitude from me. Please note, the views, information, and opinions expressed during the Becoming Sound podcast series are solely those of the individuals involved. The content of this podcast is to educate, inform, and for entertainment purposes only. This podcast series and the content presented does not constitute for medical or other professional advice or services. If you are in crisis or in need of help, please contact your medical or professional provider.